Hey there, everybody. Welcome to the THW NHL Trade Deadline Primer video series. So here's what we're going to be doing over the next little bit. My name is Jim Parsons. I'm here with hockeyraiders.com. Before we get going here, of course, you can go to the hockeyraiders.com, check out all the news and reports that we're doing on every team heading into the trade deadline on Monday, April 12th. But you can also watch the YouTube content, and each team is doing something. But this video here is going to be a series talking about each division. We're going to break them all down. And we're going to have some guests on from each division to talk about their respective teams. We'll do a rundown of the entire league, who's buying, who's selling, what are they doing, and what can we expect before Monday. And then we'll talk to each individual team, or at least some of them, about what their teams are planning on doing and what's going to be happening here Monday. So this is the video that you do not want to miss if you're interested in trade talk and speculation in news and rumors heading into Monday's deadline. We're going to be doing that coming up right away. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start in the East Division of the NHL. We've got two very special guests on with us. Jordan Jacklin covers the Buffalo Sabres. Jordan, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, Jim. Thank you very much for having me.
I appreciate you coming on. We've got Shane Sini, who covers the Pittsburgh Penguins. Shane, how you doing?
I'm great, Jim. Cheers. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem at all. So we're going to start with you guys. We'll do some quick rundowns of your team. I'll let you guys get into way more depth than I'll ever get. And then maybe what we'll do is we'll go through the rest of the teams in the East Division. You guys can weigh in on some of your thoughts on some of that stuff. Does that sound okay?
Let's do it.
Okay.
Sounds amazing.
Jordan, we're going to start with you because Buffalo is the team this year that everybody's talking about heading into the deadline. They are clearly sellers. Obviously, this is not the season that Buffalo wanted to have. GM Kevin Adams has got a lot of work to do, and he's already done a little. He's moved Eric Stahl. Let me get your first reaction on the Eric Stahl trade. I think this has to be an obvious one that we all knew was coming, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Especially after that 18-game winning streak, it was quite clear that this team, even though they believed they were playoff contenders from the beginning of the season, they had to move on from this player. And they did acquire two assets, which was nice, as we're seeing, as this is a buyer's market, right? So a lot of these players are going for a lot lower values this season than in a previous season. So they honestly did pretty well for themselves in that Eric Stahl trade.
So the return makes me wonder what's coming next, right? Because the big fish, I guess, out of Buffalo is Taylor Hall. Maybe he moves, maybe he doesn't. The recent talk is that he's probably more likely to move than stay. And not long ago, it was considered that it was maybe 50-50 that he was willing to re-sign with Buffalo. That may still be the case, but the talk and the chatter seems to be that Taylor Hall is going to go. So if you consider Eric Stahl's return and then you look at what Buffalo's asking for Hall, which we heard is a first-round pick, one, do you think they're going to get that? And two, do you think he moves before Monday?
Well, honestly, the Kyle Palmieri trade just happened yesterday, and we saw it took two NHL players just to recoup a first-round pick. And Taylor Hall, as a rental, in my opinion, is probably only going to go for a second-round pick and a middling prospect. He's had he just hasn't really had a great season. He's had a lot of historic lows in shooting percentage. He really hasn't been able to live up to his expected goals numbers. He's really had a tough season as a Sabre. It's quite evident too, just watching him play.
Two goals, not what anybody thought was going to happen with Taylor Hall when he came there, right? Like, and Shane's shaking his head down there. I can see him. Like, the idea here was that Taylor Hall was going to come in, and I wouldn't want to say the savior, but like maybe put Buffalo in a conversation to be in the playoffs this year. And that combination between Eichel and Taylor Hall, it certainly hasn't worked out this year. My question for you is, do you know, or can you tell, or do you have any idea where Hall might go? I mean, with the Palmieri trade going to the Islanders, we had thought maybe the Islanders were a team that could have been in the running there. What's your take? Do you have any ideas on where you think he'll wind up?
This is a very fascinating situation to me. And honestly, the best fit for him as of right now is the Boston Bruins. And it does seem like they're the front runners to get him. Now, obviously, the cap space is the huge issue here. This is going to have to be a third team involved, even with 50% of his salary retained, which would make his contract only $4 million for the remainder of this season. Boston really has a lot of troubles with 5-on-5 scoring, in terms of their expected goals, actual goals, high danger chances. They're ranked in the bottom third of the entire league in that category. And if you put him on a line with David Krejci, who they've been trying to find wingers for, that's what they acquired Rick Nash a couple of years ago. They tried doing that with Andre Kasha. I think Taylor Hall would really fit well on that team. And obviously there's others like the Vegas Golden Knights. The cap doesn't apply to them. I'm sure they can make it work. Colorado, Toronto is an interesting one too. We keep hearing them. I think Boston probably would be the most likely team to acquire him, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, we know they want secondary scoring, and it goes all the way back to his draft year, right? There was talk between him and Bobby Orr, his agent at the time, being interested in him going to Boston. I mean, we can trace that all the way back. So it wouldn't shock me at all. I'm just wondering, we'll talk about Boston in a second, just how much they're actually going to be buying this year. Like, I don't really know where they are. I'm not sure they even know necessarily what kind of a team they are. So it'll be very interesting to see. Last question for you regarding Buffalo. Do you see anybody else that we should be paying attention to, whether it's Sam Reinhart or Linus Allmark, or who else in Buffalo should we be watching heading into Monday?
I think it's going to be relatively quiet after the Hall trade. I think a guy like Toby Reeder could go for like a 5th or 6th round pick. And if the front office is really smart here, they should not be trading Linus Allmark. There are rumors there. And unless the price is astronomical and they can get a really good return, I say you keep your starting goaltender.
Well, we'll be interested to see how much Buffalo does. And it'd be interesting to see how much they can do, right? Like, we all think that they're going to be shopping a lot of pieces, even a Brandon Montour or something like that. We don't know. Like, it's just the cap, the flat cap, all this stuff. It could be a lot of talk and very little action. So we'll see. Shane, let's go on to Pittsburgh here. Let's talk to you about what's going on here. So we've got a new, what's Burke's title officially? President?
He's the president of hockey operations. Yeah.
Okay. And so we've got Ron Hextall, now the new GM. We know that they want to be active, right? They've said that they're looking to improve, but they don't necessarily have all the pieces to trade. They don't have a ton of draft picks. They don't have a lot of cap. Like, what do you see Pittsburgh doing, if anything?
Well, they've had a couple of months now to evaluate. So it's now time to execute. But unfortunately, when you don't have the resources, it's going to be hard to do so. So they've come out and said that they're looking for a physical winger. They're looking for a centerman. But at the same time, Jim Rutherford has emptied the cupboard. So they only have a 2nd round pick. I think they have a 6th and a few 7ths this year. So I can't see Burke or Hextall even thinking about trading a draft pick because they haven't gone through a draft yet with the team. But that being said, also a wild card thing that I see is the prospects, because none of them were drafted by Burke. None of them were drafted by Hextall. So they don't really have those ties to them. Whereas, if you've been the GM and you've seen the draft pick develop through a couple of years, maybe you're a little more reluctant to keep them as opposed to letting them go. So I could see them, trying to get a rugged winger, a physical winger, maybe somebody that can slide over to center. They've had a lot of injuries like every other year, it seems. So if they can find somebody that's versatile to play the wing, play center, and he's not afraid to get into the dirty areas, then I think that's somebody they're looking for.
So you've mentioned those are the pieces that maybe Burke and Hextall are looking for. But if you, as a fan or somebody who covers the team, could make a wish list of who you might want to see Pittsburgh go after, who would be the highest on your list?
Nick Palino of Columbus would be a nice piece. He can play the wing, kill penalties. Their PK has been terrible this year. And he's, can slide over, play some center. Miles Wood of New Jersey, somebody I like, a big physical guy, plays with speed. You got to have speed if you're playing with Pittsburgh. So he's a guy that I could see. He's got a year left in his contract too. So I don't know how much Burke and Hextall want to make a hockey trade, but he's another guy. One name that seems to be getting talked a lot this trade deadline is Luke Glendening of Detroit. Face-off specialists, and the Penguins, they need that. And when you have Malkin back, who should be back soon, McCann will slide down to that 3rd center. And I don't know if you want to have Glendening and, sell off a couple prospects for a 4th line center that might not move the needle. But he's somebody that could kill penalties and win those key draws. So somebody that's certainly on the radar for sure. And I think he's only making 1.8 last year of his deal. It's the kind of guy you can sneak in under the cap at the deadline.
Do you think Pittsburgh's going to be really active here? Like, is this a situation where we've got a new GM, we've got a new president, we've got some aging players, we've got some injuries going on here? Is this a lot of talk and maybe not a lot of action? Or do you think that Pittsburgh actually kind of swings for it here and tries to make a deal here before Monday?
I think Burke was pretty open right away, saying that, we're going to win now. We're not going to, the Crosby trade rumors and all that jazz went down pretty quick when they took over. And I think it's mostly talk, to be honest. I think it's going to be quiet just because they don't have much to work with. And the fact is they don't really want to mortgage too much of the future when really they don't have much to deal with anyway. So I think they'll take the rest of the year to evaluate. If they do anything, it'll be small. Don't expect a blockbuster deal out of Pittsburgh, not at all.
Awesome. Okay. let's move on to a couple other teams that you guys don't specifically cover. Neither do I, but we can talk about a little bit. We talked about Boston. I'll get you guys to weigh in on some of this. So here's how I see it, and let me know if you agree with me, disagree with me, or have another opinion here. We know secondary scoring is probably high on their priority list. They've got some injuries that they're dealing with. They've got Rask, who's got some nagging stuff going on. Charlie McAvoy, Brandon Carlo. So and like I said before, I don't really know what Boston is going to do. Are they buying? Because they're kind of in that fourth position. They may be a team that gets bounced early, but they could also be a team that goes on a bit of a run. Jordan, what do you see? Do you see Boston as buyers, standing pat? What do you see them doing? I mean, you mentioned Taylor Hall might be a fit there. That would make them buyers. What are you thinking?
Oh, they're totally buyers. Patrice Bergeron and Brad Marchand aren't getting any younger, so you got to try to win a cup in their prime just as much as you can. There's a short window here. It's closing soon.
Yeah, Shane, I was going to ask you the same question. Considering the age of some of these players and most of that scoring comes in from that top line, do you see Boston being active, trying to fit and get some depth there, or are they just going to ride that horse all the way through the playoffs if they can?
Well, the asking price is pretty low for Taylor Hall. I think that's somebody they're definitely going to be interested in. Another name to consider too is a depth defenseman, Jamie Oleksiak from Dallas. They lost that Chara presence for the playoffs, and he's a big body has playoff experience, and he's not scared to drop the gloves. So good guys to have on your side for the playoffs.
Let's move to the other side of the coin here. Talk about the New Jersey Devils for a second. So we've seen them sell already. We know they've moved Kyle Palmieri, they've moved Travis Zajac. What else do you think they're going to sell? Shane, I'll start with you. Do you see New Jersey being way more active prior to Monday, or was this it? Was this the big move for that team?
I think they might be active. They have a couple of pieces on defense that, Ryan Murray, even I know PK Subban's name's come up in the last few weeks, but I think they'll be active. They got a couple of pieces there. They really haven't put it together. They had high expectations this year and never really materialized. I think the Corey Crawford news set them off kind of early, but I could see them doing something. I could see them maybe Jordan, more of a hockey deal. Sorry, but more of a hockey deal than anything else. But I think they'll be active for sure.
Do you think they're going to be moving everything not nailed down, and at least not in their really young core? Not named Hughes, not named Heischer, things like that, Jordan?
Oh, yeah, totally. And a name I've heard a lot is Dmitry Kulikov, surprisingly. For a third-pairing defender, I've heard his name linked to multiple teams. I think they're going to get probably like a 4th or 5th round pick for that type of player.
Yeah, they should be able to restock pretty good. Okay, let's move on to the Islanders. They added Palmieri. We had heard they were going to be on some stuff. The big deal here is that Anders Lee's gone down, right? That's why they've got all this cap space, and that's why they can do some stuff. Do you think this was it? Like Palmieri was their big move? Jordan, I'll start with you. Is that the guy, or is Lou Lamoriello still got other stuff up his sleeve here?
Yeah, I think this is probably it for this team. Pierre LeBrun was speculating that he also believed Nick Foligno was a guy that Lou would want to acquire, but you got 2 players here in this deal. They have an abundance of forward depth now. I think this team's probably good. Maybe a depth defender if they can squeeze it in there.
Do you agree there, Shane?
Yeah, I do. Depth defender for sure. It seems when they got Zajac with Palmieri, I was kind of shocked, to be honest. I think they're definitely just stick with D. Looks like they got their forward group ready to go.
The New York Rangers seem like a team to me that is normally active, but might not be very active this year. Jordan, do you see them being quiet? Do you see them doing stuff? Is there anything to really take of note out of the Rangers organization?
Well, it's interesting because the Rangers contributor here at THW, Brandon Adsop, actually wrote an article recently about Julien Gautier's future with the team. And he's kind of actually been a decent player when he actually gets a chance to play. But as we know with David Quinn, he likes to kind of sit his prospects, So I could see them potentially moving him to get him some change of scenery. But besides that, it doesn't really seem like they're going to be doing too much there.
I saw, Shane, that the fourth period was talking about Alexander Georgiev today. I don't know how much truth there is to that at all. Can you possibly see them moving a goalie?
No, they have a luxury there with 2 young guys, on the cheap. So that's something that a lot of teams would, jealous of and would love to have. One name that just always seems to be linked to the Rangers is Jack Eichel. Maybe that's a summer deal. I don't think that much going to happen before the deadline. Don't get me wrong, but I could see them visiting that in the summer. And if he is available, and that's the route the Sabres want to take, of course, Jordan might know more than me, but that could be a name that you see go there, but sometime in the summer.
All right, Jordan, I'll give you 15 seconds. What do you think happens with Jack Eichel? Obviously, probably not this year, but do you see him being moved next or in the summer or next year?
I think if it's going to be anybody, it's going to be the New York Rangers. That's what I'll say about that.
Well, you guys aren't too far off. Okay, Washington seems like Maybe a buyer to me, but I don't really know what they could buy. They've got maybe Henrik Lundqvist coming back. If possible, he might play this season. It's a goalie, maybe, right? Like, are we in agreement that that might be what they're looking for?
I agree 100%. If Lundqvist isn't coming back, which, hey, that could be the story of the year if he does. But if he doesn't come back, I see David Rittich from Calgary. They're out of the playoffs. So pending free agent, somebody they could get on the cheap, especially if some salaries retained. Because, yeah, they don't have too much money to work with. But I could see them adding a goalie, yeah.
Jordan, do you think that the Rangers owe this team anything? Because nobody expected them to be this good. It's not like they're wonderful, but they certainly weren't expected to be a fantastic team coming into this season. Do they owe it to the players to maybe add something?
Yeah, I mean, if it's available and it's relatively cheap, it's really good to reward the group there, and it really establishes a good culture if they can at least get maybe some type of extra forward for secondary scoring.
Okay, so I haven't heard a ton coming out of Philadelphia, other than maybe Scott Laughton's name being potentially moved. Jordan, I'll start with you. Any comments on that? You think that's a deal that's going to happen before Monday?
Yeah, I've heard some interesting theories about that, and I think he could be a fit with the Pittsburgh Penguins, actually. But the problem with those two teams is it's pretty difficult to make a trade. Even the Mark Streit trade a few years ago acquired a third team, so that won't be an easy negotiation process.
Okay, well, Shane, let me throw this at you then. We already seen an in-division trade between New Jersey and New York Islanders. Does that rule out the possibility of Pittsburgh dealing with Philadelphia? I know there could be a third team involved here, but is this season totally throw all that stuff out the window?
It's you never know. You never know for sure, but I don't think it's going to happen. And given that there would be a chance that a third team would be required, I just don't think Hextall and Burke have that up their sleeve. But as far as Laughton's game goes, like hey man, I should have mentioned him earlier, but he would fit the bill absolutely perfectly. So I know he wants to be a Flyer though, and he's hoping to sign a long term there. So we'll see if they end up selling him before the deadline, but I could see him circling back to Philly afterwards.
Awesome. And any final comments, anything that we might have missed before we close the book here on the East Division?
It's it's still close. Like there's you have your top four, but there's still Philly on the outskirts there that maybe they don't want to sell a guy like Laughton or who knows. But it should be interesting down the stretch. And if I had to say, of course, I'm a little bit biased, but I think Pittsburgh or potentially Washington come out of the division.
What about you, Jordan? Any final comments on this East Division?
It's interesting because the middling teams in this division are really going to be establishing their identities after this trade deadline, like a team like the Philadelphia Flyers, New York Rangers. So in a division that's kind of all over the place, we'll see some of the true identities of these teams after this Monday's trade deadline.
Awesome. Well, Jordan, Shane, thank you. Yeah. I appreciate you guys coming on to talk about your teams in some of the East Division. And for everybody else who's still watching this, we're going to be moving on to the next division right after this. All right, everybody, we are back again. Now we're talking about the Central Division. We've got Devin Little with us who talks about Detroit. Devin, how you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. And Greg Boyson covers Chicago Blackhawks. Greg, how are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you both coming on. So we'll start with your teams, and then we'll chat a little bit about the rest of the teams in the division. Devin, we'll talk about you and the Detroit Red Wings and what's going on there. For most accounts, this is a team that's probably going to sell pretty close to everything that isn't nailed down. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty much anybody not named Dylan Larkin, Moritz Seider, or Lucas Raymond.
Okay, so let's go through a couple of the names that might be on the list there. Let's talk about Bobby Ryan. What do you think the chances are that Ryan gets moved here before Monday?
If I could label Ryan as anything, I would label him as the most likely to get dealt. I think that that was more or less the purpose of him coming to Detroit, was to have a decent year and then get flipped the deadline. Send him off to a contender and get the Red Wings some future assets.
What about Mark Stahl? Now, there's a guy that might be a little bit trickier to move. They acquired him this offseason more as like a cap deal than anything else. Do you think he's got a chance of going, or is that just too high a price to pay for a defenseman that may not give you a ton?
I think that there's a chance. I think that's probably the best way to describe it. It'll definitely depend on who's fishing around him. There's got to be some cap maneuvering. Wings are going to have to eat half. And I'm not expecting anything crazy. I'm not expecting like a second round pick for him, like the Wings got to take him on. But I do think that given the right situation, there could be a move.
Luke Glendening's name has been brought up a lot. We've heard connections to a handful of teams, including the Edmonton Oilers. Face-off specialist, I think he's probably still leading the league in face-off percentage. Is this a given? Is he going?
I think so. It's definitely one of those situations where there's smoke, there's fire. I've heard his name just like you way too many times for me to think that he's going to be staying put in Detroit.
And I guess one name that has come up a little bit, but maybe less likely to go, Anthony Mantha. Do you think there's anything to that talk?
I think that there is something to the talk. I'm not convinced that it'll be ahead of the deadline. I think that might end up being more of a off-season type of deal. But I do think that again, where there's smoke, there's fire, and his name is coming out for good reason.
Any names I didn't mention that you want to make sure that we talk about here before Monday, what fans of the Red Wings should watch for?
I think just in general, my big thing is I'm kind of expecting to be surprised. Just because, we go through the names we just went through. Those are kind of the obvious candidates. But Steve Yzerman has never been known to just kind of do what's expected. So even if we see a unexpected name get moved, that fits Yzerman's MO. So I don't know. I'm getting excited. I hope that I'm surprised come deadline day.
So I'll ask this same question of you that I've asked of most people. Do you think it's busier than we think, or it's going to be really, really quiet like some people are expecting?
I think that compared to other years, it'll be quiet, but that doesn't mean that there won't be action. I think that you'll get guys like Bobby Ryan moved, but I'm not expecting big old blockbusters by any means.
Right on. Okay, Greg, let's still move on to Chicago here. Let's talk first about the trade that already happened. So Brett Connolly goes to Chicago among some other pieces. Can you give me your first thoughts on that trade and what you saw from yesterday?
Well, first of all, it's weird that the Blackhawks are taking on salary. We're so used to them being on the other side, having to get rid of prospects in order to get rid of bad contracts. But now the shoe's kind of on the other foot. Brett Connolly isn't the piece that you were concerned about. I mean, that's just taking on a contract. Obviously, Florida, we'll probably talk about them in a minute. They've got some bigger plans here. They're clearing up space. Getting Stillman and Borgstrom are those are the pieces there. Stan Bowman loves his reclamation projects. He loves getting guys that need a quote unquote change of scenery. Sometimes they've worked out. It worked out pretty well for Dylan Strome. So Conley's fits the mold of that type of veteran contract you have to expose for the expansion draft. So I think that's his role there. And if not, you get a veteran guy here that might help with some young players. So, I don't think it's a huge move by any means, but it definitely could help you with two possible future pieces in Stillman and Borgstrom.
Well, the whole taking on salaries question was what I was going to ask you next. How much do you think that's going to play a continued factor here before the deadline? Is it overstated how much people are talking about Chicago being willing to take on this money, or is this it? Like, are there going to be a couple more deals in this kind of area or vein, or do we think this is probably the deal they're doing?
There definitely could be another one or two of these. They have, heading in before this deal, they had over $20 million in cap space because of all the players they have on long-term IR. So there's definitely a chance to pick up stuff as long as it's not, that the Conley thing is a little unsettling because there's 2 years left of that deal. But it expires before you really have to start worrying about signing some of these young guys. But if there's a bad contract that say expires at the end of this year, and you can get a top, a higher draft pick or good prospect, then I could see that happening for sure.
So I've seen and read Stan Bowman say that they're not adding. There's no reason to do that. They're going to stick with their young prospects and play those guys. Is that the right take for you, considering where Chicago's at in the standings? They played better than most people thought they were going to play this season. What's your take on their approach to the rest of these last 4 or 5 days?
That is absolutely 100% the correct way to do it. Now, granted, I always take what a general manager says with a grain of salt, especially this time of year, but that's the way to do it. You don't say rebuild before the season starts and then say, oh, well, we got a chance to maybe, get swept out of the first round by Tampa Bay. So let's trade all of our prospects. It's the right way to do it. Yes, their record is a lot better than we expected, but the last month of the season, they've regressed to the team that I think we're going to see from the get-go. There was a little bit of smoke and mirrors there. The first 2 months, they had an unbelievable power play. The goaltending was out of this world. And when they were losing past regulation, still getting points. Since March 1st has come around, the power play has gone silent. The goaltending's come back down to earth, and they've been losing in regulation. So this is more the team that probably should have started the year. So holding on to your assets, flipping a couple veterans to get more assets, that is the right thing to do for sure.
Awesome. Okay, so let's do a quick run through of the rest of the Central Division here. We'll start with Carolina. Here's what I see. There's been some talk from Waddell about his 3 goalies and maybe moving one. Do you think Carolina moves, Devin? I'll start with you. Do you think Carolina moves one of these goaltenders, or they keep the whole, we need that third, it's not a bad idea? Because they're doing very well this season. It's not the worst idea in the world to have insurance at that position.
Yeah, I think they will make a move eventually, but I don't think it happens by the deadline. I think that, especially with COVID and all the other sorts of things going on right now, it definitely helps to have that third goalie, that ultimate insurance policy, and they can kind of reassess things after the playoffs.
And Greg, we know that Carolina's got some pretty big contracts coming due here. They got some players that are going to make some serious money, but they're right up there, right? They're one of the contenders at this point. Do you think Carolina adds? Do you think they play it safe, considering they don't want to take on? I mean, they could do rentals without having to affect their contracts, but what do you see Carolina doing here?
Honestly, I would say they're going to get looking for more depth guys. You know, those bottom 6 guys, the third pairing defensive guys. I think they're pretty set up top with their lineup. Now, granted, if they wanted to do the rental player, I've been covering the Chicago Wolves all season. Their AHL team, they do have some nice prospects that could definitely land them one of these big rental players if they choose that route. But I think they're pretty satisfied with what they have, and it's hard not to be when you look at their top 6. So they might go out and, they could be a guy that could be back to the Blackhawks, go out and get like a Matthias Janmark, that type of player to kind of fill out PK and defensive roles for the playoffs.
Okay, let's move on to Columbus, because here's a team that we've been talking about a lot lately. We have to probably all agree that they're out of it at this point. David Savard, he might even be the belle of the ball in the blue line, because we don't know that Matthias Ekholm's going to get moved. So what do you think, Devin, happens with David Savard? Do you think, 1, he's gone for sure, he's sitting out of the lineup now, and 2, do you have any idea where he might go?
I do think he gets dealt. I think at this point, Columbus needs to get what they can to kind of reset the board for next season. And as for where he goes, I really like the fit with Winnipeg. I don't know that is ultimately where he goes, but I do like that, and I can see it happening. I know that Elliot Friedman has mentioned Tampa as kind of a stealth team for him. I'd like to see how that deal could take form, but I do like that fit as well. But just in general, I see him moved, and I see him getting moved to a team that really needs that right side. Maybe even Florida, considering they just lost Ekblad as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the connection between Savard and Winnipeg too, and it makes a lot of sense to me, although I have also heard that he's not on the top of their list. There's a couple guys ahead of him that they'd like to go shoot for first, but you never know, that could change. What about Nick Palino, Greg? Here's a guy that's got a huge legacy in Columbus. It's really up to him whether or not he wants to go anywhere, even though he's only got a 10-team modified. Do you think he moves? Do you think he stays put? Does he go into him back? Like, what do you think happens with Palino here?
That's a tough situation. He's such a big part of that franchise, and it's such a fan favorite. It's really hard. You got to think of all the other aspects that come in with moving, not just what happens on the ice, but how does that affect your PR, your ticket sales? Granted, ticket sales aren't the top of the list this season, but going forward, so all those factors have to be in it. And as you said, ultimately it's going to be, his decision. And I think, he's earned that right to say, I want to go to a contender. No, I want to play it out here. So I would say that's a 50-50. If they get the right situation where he feels that he's got a legitimate chance to win a Stanley Cup, say a Carolina or, a team like that makes a phone call, I could see it happening. But, on the flip side, I could see him staying put as well. I think it's an even odds on that one.
Yeah, it wouldn't shock me at all if he's one of the names that everybody talks about all the way up to Monday, and then it wouldn't shock me at all if it never doesn't happen, right? It's one of those deals that just, if it doesn't happen, nobody will be surprised and be like, yeah, of course he was going to stay. That's all. We figured he would, right? Like, that's the deal. What about Dallas? Greg, I'll start with you. I really don't know what to say about the Dallas Stars. Like, they're a team that might do absolutely nothing, could sell. Maybe they think with some games in hand that they got a shot at this thing. Like, what's your take on Dallas?
I don't know anymore. That's a team I've been warning my colleagues on Blackhawks Banter for the last 3 or 4 weeks. We got to watch out for them when we're talking about, hey, who could catch the Blackhawks for that last spot? You know, they had all those games in hand. They might not have to make a deadline deal if they get Sagan and Bishop. I'm not 100% sure what their statuses are. I know they were expecting them back. You get either of those guys back, that's better than anything you're going to make on the trade. They're 1 year removed from a Stanley Cup final, and now they could be selling. I don't know. I just think it's a weird, icky, injury plague season down there that they just kind of have to be like, we don't really need to reset things. I think they're closer to the team that made the Stanley Cup final last year than the team we've seen this year. So I would, if I was a betting man, and thankfully I'm not, because I would lose a lot more than I win, I would say they're more category of kind of staying put, maybe taking on some players that they could see using going forward beyond this season.
I don't know how to expand on anything better than that. So we're going to move right over to Florida. Devin, let's go there with you. We've talked a little bit about the Panthers already, and you think David Savard might be a fit there. We know they've got some cap space. I expect that they'll do something. I mean, they're way up there. Bill Zito's a new GM, wants to make splash probably. Mm-hmm. What do you think Florida does? Do you think they take a huge swing here? Are they the guys that might hit the home run before Monday?
It certainly seems like they're positioning themselves to be with the deal they just swung with Chicago. They've got quite a bit of cap space all of a sudden, and I can't imagine that Bill Zito opened that up just to have it. I don't know that I've seen a lot of things saying Taylor Hall is going to go there. I don't know that is necessarily what I see happening. I know I just mentioned David Savard. I think that does make a lot of sense, not even just because of the Ekblad thing, but because of Zito and his Columbus connections. So I can see something like that. I do think they'll make a swing. How big of one, I think, depends on the other players in the marketplace.
Greg, do you think this is a huge year for Florida?
I think they think it is. As you mentioned, Bill Zito first year. This isn't a team that's had a ton of trips to the playoffs. And outside of a historical collapse here, they're pretty much all assured of a trip this year. So I think they're going to go for it. And I think that's a good thing. That's a team that, when things are going good, they do well down there. So they're in need of that boost. And what better way to make a first impression as a GM than getting a Taylor Hall or David Savard and giving it a shot. The Lightning get all the love down in Florida. So maybe it's time to say, hey, there's 2 teams down here. Perfect opportunity for them.
There you go. Okay, so we got 2 teams left, and we got about 2 minutes to cover them. So, Greg, I'll let you talk about the Lightning because you brought them up. Are they buyers?
Yeah,
I don't know
just
how you
like
can.
Carolina.
With no cap space, how can you be, right?
Well, I mean, just like Carolina, if they can find a cheap depth guy, they'll probably make a move. Otherwise, they're not getting it. They're not getting any of the top rentals.
And Devin, what about Nashville? I mean, here's a team that we all started talking about at the beginning of this because we figured they might be the busiest team, and now they aren't probably poised to do anything. Like, do you see anything coming out of Nashville? Do you see that they're going to even buy at this point? Because they look like they're locked that 4th spot up almost.
Their rise over the last month or so has changed the landscape in more ways than one. I think that if they do anything, they might do a soft sell, soft buy, where maybe they just kind of trade one problem for another type of thing. See if they get somebody who gets a little boost in a new environment. But I don't see them trading Ekholm anymore. I don't see them offloading the pieces that we were talking about a month ago. But I also don't think they're in a position to really go for it. So do they stay put? Possibly. Might even be the best option. But if anything, it's probably a small switcheroo type of move.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate both of you coming on to help us talk about the Central Division. Greg, Devin, thank you very much. And for everybody who's watching this, don't forget, like and subscribe to the page. Hit the thumbs up button on Facebook if that's where you're watching this. And stay tuned because we've got another division coming up right next. All right, everybody, we're moving on over to the Western Division. We've got Louis Pinon from the Arizona Coyotes, who covers the Arizona Coyotes for the Hockey Raiders. Louis, how you doing?
Doing well today. How are you?
I'm doing well. And Josh Brojolin covers the San Jose Sharks. Is that right, Josh?
Yeah. You have
awesome. Yeah, no problem at all. So let's start with those two teams. Lewis, we'll start with you. Arizona is a very interesting team this year because I don't know if they're sellers. I don't know if they're buyers. I'm not sure exactly what they are. They're kind of in the middle of the road. What's your immediate take on what you think Arizona is going to do here before Monday?
Definitely. I think you're right on when you said it's kind of an interesting situation there. They kind of didn't really look like a playoff team for most of this season. And then here in the last couple of weeks, they've really turned it on with, I think, 7 wins in their last 10 games. So, I could see them maybe being buyers at the deadline, but I'm not sure if they have, enough draft picks or any prospects that they want to give up in order to, get anything significant in return, I guess. They lost some draft picks in the Taylor Hall trade last year. They obviously had the prospect thing that they lost some draft picks for. So there's not a whole lot there for Armstrong to work with, the general manager. So I could see it going either way. If the series over the weekend against Vegas maybe doesn't go their way and they find themselves back in a 3-way tie with maybe the Blues and the Sharks for that last playoff spot, they maybe could be sellers. But if they can, somehow maintain this 3-point lead and, hang on to that, I could see them maybe add a piece or two.
Yeah, it's almost a situation where their decision needs to be made for them. You know what I mean? Like
Really
based
does,
on how the games go, either put us in one category or don't. Just don't leave us hanging here because this is killing us. Speaking of that stuff, what about like Conor Garland? I mean, there's lots to talk about him, but I mean, does Arizona want to move him?
I would definitely say they don't want to move him, but I think the money might be a problem, especially with, how things have gone for the team for the last 10 years. Money is always a problem for the Coyotes. And I think the word on the street is that Garland's going to be looking for Clayton Keller money, which is about $7 million per year. And that's, Coyotes have, unexpectedly they're a salary cap team this year. So they're going to have to, maybe juggle some money around if they want to bring Garland back next year and give him that raise. So I wouldn't expect to see him be traded, but if the Coyotes maybe are blown away with an offer, or if they kind of fall out of contention over the weekend here in Vegas, I could see it maybe happening, but I wouldn't put any money down on them trading Conor Garland just yet. Maybe over the offseason if they can't, figure out a contract or something like that.
Well, you mentioned the money and that it's mostly about salary with him. Asks or poses or leads to an interesting question in terms of money, because coming into this season, the talk about Arizona was that they were going to shed some salary. So they were talking about moving like Darcy Kemper or maybe Antti Ranta or what have you. What do you think happens there? I mean, I've heard Kemper's name pop up a couple times here recently. They could still move him. I'm sure there'd be a market for him. There's not a ton of goaltenders available. What do you think happens with the goalie situation in Arizona?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a change coming for sure. You've had Adin Hill really emerge in the last couple of weeks. Even in the last couple of years, he's been above average, when he's been called upon. But in the last couple of weeks, especially with Ranta out and with Kemper out, he's started every game in a couple of back-to-backs, and he's played really well. So you figure they have 3 goaltenders right now on the roster that can, be starters, and they probably, obviously only need 2 of them. So if something comes up for either Darcy Kemper or Ranta, I would probably assume more Ranta, since he's going to be back from injured reserve, I think more sooner than Kemper will be. I could definitely see them moving a goaltender, but probably Ranta would be the one I would think with the trade deadline possibly.
No, I'm not sure if I have this right, but is it true? Do they have 9 UFAs?
They do have a lot coming up. I think almost the entire blue line is coming up. I think Demers, Goligoski, Hjalmarsson, Labushkin are going to be free agents, and they have a couple forwards as well. So yeah, they do have quite a few. I think Ranta's a UFA as well. They got a couple RFAs. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of changes this summer coming up for sure.
Do you see any of those names being of interest to other teams here before Monday?
Goligoski has been mentioned a lot in recent weeks, but like we've talked about, like the Coyotes have, won 7 games out of the last 10. So they might elect to hang on to him and just go for that number 4 seed, or they could, move him and try to get some of those draft picks back. But he's not having a great year this year. He's always been a kind of a 30, 35 point guy on the blue line, but this year those numbers have been kind of down. So I would assume the value might be down as well. So it might be just worth it to hang on to him and try to make a run for it. But I guess we'll have to see kind of what the rental market looks like. And especially since he's a right-handed defenseman, it's always, those are always in high demand this time of year.
There's always righties that people want to get their hands on. Thanks for that on Arizona. Josh, let's move on to San Jose, because there's another interesting team that we assume is probably going to be sellers, but are they in a situation where they have contracts that will be attractive to other teams? Like, do you see anybody on that roster that's really going to stand out and be like, yeah, I can see some guys coming for these guys?
Not really. There's there's so many players that are tied up to large contracts and they have no trade clauses. It's hard to move them. They have a few UFAs that I'm sure they'll look to move as rentals, Dubnyk being the main one, but there just isn't really a huge market for goaltenders, especially when there's so many available. So I can't really see him being moved. Nieto would probably be the best one. He's currently injured, so it's hard to move him. And then I think the Sharks are trying to get Sorensen and Marlowe to be available, but I don't think there's too much of a market for him. Like, they moved Marlowe up to power play 1 kind of unprompted to try to boost that a little bit.
Yeah.
Sorensen's been held out of games. So I think they're trying to see what kind of players are going to be, they can move, but I'm just not sure there's a huge like a need for them. And then also out of nowhere, they've become close to a playoff spot. So it's kind of a balance of wanting to not really like contend, but also the division's very top heavy. And there's this really weird, like 3 to 4 way like battle for this 4th spot that they could find themselves in. I just still think they need as many assets as possible. So moving these guys that are probably going to leave or retire is probably their best option.
Well, you brought up Patrick Marlowe, so I'll ask you about him specifically, because here's a player that, you know, if San Jose wants to do this guy a favor, and you've already said that they might be trying to shop him or make him appealing to other teams, but here's a guy that's set to break a pretty significant record. Does San Jose care about that at all? Like, are they even thinking about the fact that he has the chance to break the games played record, or are they just like, no, if we can move him, we'll move him?
I think they're putting it solely on his plate. At the last few press conferences, he's been asked about it pretty much every time. And he said he'd welcome a move. He, in a recent press conference, said that he plans on playing next season. I'm not sure that there's going to be a huge attraction for him. So this could be his last season, whether he wants to or not. So it comes down to if he wants to break the Gordie Howe games played record in San Jose, or if he wants to kind of make one last run for it. It seems similar to last season with Joe Thornton. They basically said, hey, if you want to get moved, we'll tell you. And I think there was only one team in on him, and they weren't an outright contender. So he just decided not to. So I think it comes down to what he wants to do. And I think he'd welcome it if it's someone that's a really strong contender, like a Toronto or some team that's at the top of the division. If it's a team of lesser status, I don't think he'll want to.
So you mentioned Devin Dubicon. I'll come back to him really quickly. Gut reaction, yes or no? Does he get moved or does he stay put?
I say yes, but I don't think it's going to be for very much.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, we're going to fly through the rest of the division. If you guys hear me say something that you want to chime in on, I'll throw it to you. If not, throw it back at me. Let's talk about the Anaheim Ducks a little bit. We assume that they're sellers, but who they're trying to sell, we don't know if they're actually willing to move. Rickard Rakell, Josh Manson are the names that I'm thinking of. We've heard Ryan Getzlaf's name out there, but he makes a ton of money. I'm not sure that anybody can afford to get him. Lewis, what's your thought on Anaheim? Do you see anybody getting moved out of there?
I think the for sale sign is definitely going out in front of the Honda Center over there. But like you said, there's not a whole lot of options there. They're a pretty young team this year. And like you said, Rakell might be the only, viable option. But I think he's signed through next year, so he wouldn't be purely a rental, I don't believe. I'd have to look that up. But I think he's signed.
No, yeah, you're right. He's got one more year.
So yeah, there's a couple of players there that could be moved, but they're mostly a young team, so there's not a whole lot out there. I can't imagine them moving John Gibson or any of the goaltenders. I can't imagine there'd be a market for Ryan Miller. But I think Rickard Rakell would probably be the most likely player to get moved out of Anaheim.
Josh, do you think the price might be too high? Because we're talking about players. I mean, Getzlaf's price won't be high, but his salary is really high. Rakell, they're going to ask for the moon. Josh Manson, they love, so they're going to ask for the moon. Do you think that this is just too expensive in this market with the amount of cap space people don't have?
Yeah, I think if there's going to be a player like that move, they're going to need a broker, which is actually something that reminds me the Sharks are looking, many teams are looking to broker deals in that way, where they'll take on salary for assets. But I just don't know, because I feel like, at least personally, I thought more was going to get there's going to be more traded for Palmieri, and there wasn't. So it kind of indicates that the market is a little more suppressed than you would have anticipated. So I think the asking price on Manson is going to be huge, and I don't think any team's going to want to give it up at this point when everything is so uncertain for the future.
I guess the good news with the Palmieri thing is the first did get moved. So we know that people are willing to move a first. Like, I don't know, maybe this is the year to do it because the scouting's so goofy. All right, Colorado. Josh, I'll start with you. This is the hottest team maybe in the NHL probably, right? Like, we assume they're probably going to be buyers because you could just add that little piece here. What do you think happens? Does Colorado make a big swing, or are they kind of just, we're pretty good?
I don't know. I feel like goaltending at this point is their need. Devin Dubicon, not really. But they're gonna. I mean, after what happened last night, gave up. Grubauer had like a 6-something save percentage, and then the goal they just traded for gave up 1 goal on 1 shot. I think they're gonna probably look for some kind of goaltender, and then maybe just kind of look at how I guess Tampa Bay approached last season, where they added like Blake Coleman and Barclay Goodrow, where there was just kind of pieces to supplement this incredible core, but not a huge addition like a Kyle Palmieri or a Taylor Hall.
Well, if you're crossing your fingers for Dubnyk to go to Colorado, I have heard his name there. I have heard his name attached to Colorado. I've also heard Jonathan Bernier, though. Louis, do you agree? Is Colorado basically shopping for a goaltender, and that's probably it?
Yeah, I would imagine the backup goaltending would be their one and only need right now. I know we saw actually, I think the new guy they got from Buffalo, Johansson, we saw his first game. He played against the Coyotes. I think he gave up 2 goals in his first 3 shots. So that didn't start well for Colorado. But I haven't heard anything about Pavel Francouz coming back from injury. I know he was really good last year, but I haven't heard anything new about him as of late. So if they're not going to get him back this year, I would imagine the backup goaltender would have to be a huge need. You know, like you said, Grubauer had a rough night last night, and they've been overworking him a lot this year, and especially in the compressed schedule. So they got to get him some help before the playoffs.
Louis, I'll stick with you. We'll move on to the Los Angeles Kings. I've heard a couple little whispers coming out of there, like Dustin Brown, maybe even Jonathan. I just don't know how realistic either of those players going anywhere will be. Do you think LA does anything?
I think LA's in the same boat as kind of Anaheim right now. They have a lot of veteran guys that are making a lot of money, and then they have a lot of young guys as well that they probably would like to build around. So like you said, Jonathan Quick's been mentioned, but I think he's making almost $6 million, and he's got some term left. And same thing with Dustin Brown, and I can't imagine them wanting to move Kopitar or Doughty or any of those guys. So it'd probably have to be a mid-tier guy, maybe Andreas Athanasiou or somebody like that would have to be one of the guys that could be moved, because I can't imagine them wanting to move one of their young up-and-coming players, or in the veteran core might be making too much money to be moved.
Moving on to the Minnesota Wild, Josh, I'll go to you. If you have a team like Minnesota, who probably people didn't figure would be where they are, and are in a position to maybe do something here and contend a little bit, and they're better than people thought they would. If you're in that position, do you make sure, if you're GM Bill Guerin, that you add for this team? Or are you kind of like, hey, we didn't expect to be here. If we get bounced in the first round, well, we get bounced in the first round. Like, what would you do if you're Minnesota? Would you add?
I would add, but I wouldn't move a first. I wouldn't move something super substantial like Marco Rossi or something incredible like that, because you're still planning on the future being bright. So you don't want to mortgage an asset on doing well currently. I mean, you're going to build around Kaprizov and Fiala for the future. So maybe I'm trying to think what their needs are. They probably don't need blue line or goaltending currently with how incredible their tandem has been recently. I don't think they'll buy, but I think it's similar to Colorado, where we mostly depth pieces, and their stars will continue to be their stars.
Yeah, I think Minnesota probably tries to add maybe something little, just because Guerin's going to be like, hey, you guys, there's a few teams in that situation, right? Where it's like, let me throw you a little bit of a bone. Nobody figured we'd be in this position, and I really appreciate that you got us here. You've worked this hard. Maybe we can give you a little something, but you're right. I don't think they're giving up futures. Here's a team, though, Louis, in St. Louis, who I think is very, very interesting, because they look like they now are saying, well, I think we might be out of it. And so they're talking about Mike Hoffman. They're talking about Tyler Bozak. They're talking like Armstrong's the kind of GM that just, once he makes up his mind, he's going to do whatever he's going to do. And he's pretty good at getting high returns for these things. Do you think St. Louis is one of the bigger sellers? And, a week ago, we didn't see that happening.
It's going to be really interesting. Like you said, Arizona is currently in that number 4 spot, but I can't imagine St. Louis would think they'd be out of it, especially with the tough schedule the Coyotes have coming up. So it's definitely surprising to see, Mike Hoffman being mentioned. He's had a pretty decent year in St. Louis so far, but if I was in St. Louis, I'd want to go for it. I can't imagine that the 3-point deficit right now is a whole lot to overcome. And they just played a pretty good game against Vegas the other night, beat them 3-1. So, if they think they're out of it, I can definitely see the need to start moving pieces, but I don't think they're done yet. I think they could come back and get that number 4 spot. It's been a month for them, so they just got to turn it around. Yeah,
and that's a very interesting take, because maybe they don't think they're out of it. Josh, what if they think that they're still contending, but they don't have the right pieces to go as far as they'd like to go. And maybe Mike Hoffman's underperforming, or maybe Tyler Bozak's taking up too much money. Do you see a situation, Josh, where maybe St. Louis sells and then turns around and buys right away?
I can see that. I feel like there's two players that don't really fit with their kind of form or how they're kind of underutilized, and that's Hoffman and Vince Dunn. I feel like both of them are kind of not really used how they could be in much larger roles in different teams, and I feel like teams would pay a decent amount for those kinds of players. And with that large value in return, they could use some of it to get a replacement type, either, I don't know, bottom pairing defenseman to replace what they gave up, or something along those lines. I don't think they're out of it. I mean, they've been decimated by injuries this season. I don't think it's really a great reflection of what the team they are. So I think they could probably do a little bit of both, but getting large value for a player like Hoffman or Dunn or Bozak is something that they would totally be interested in.
For sure. Vegas, we could talk about all day long because everybody talks about Vegas and they're always in on everything, but they don't seem to have a lot of cap space. So what can they do? Lewis, do you see a situation where Vegas can do anything? Like, can they buy? Would they sell? Like, they're the most active team when it comes to adding pieces and spending money. Can they do anything at this deadline?
I can't imagine too much happening in Vegas unless they move money out at the same time. I saw something they only were able to dress 17 skaters the other day because of salary cap constraints. So yeah, unless they're moving some money out in any trade that's bringing people back, I can't imagine anything major happening out of Vegas this year. I think they're already in pretty good shape, but if they wanted to add somebody, they'd have to move some money out.
And Josh, I'll finish with you and we'll talk about Seattle. Now, they're not going to be adding pieces, obviously, but they could be adding draft picks. I mean, they might be adding something. How much of a factor do you think the Kraken are playing in this deadline? Like, we've heard that there's some talk that people have gone to Ron Francis and said, hey, what would you do, or what would you be willing to offer us if we said, hey, we want you to steer in this direction? And it's high. It's like a first round pick and a prospect and whatever. How much of a factor, Josh, do you think Seattle is playing in all this?
I think it's the largest factor in the goaltending market. I mean, I feel like Dreiger and Khudobin are the largest kind of examples of that, where the Stars and the Panthers are like, well, you're not gonna be able to keep these guys, but we also don't want to give them up. But they're kind of forcing their hand to move them at some point. I think that's part of it. Obviously, there's going to be teams like the Sharks with huge contracts. They're going to be like, hey, could you please take this? I just don't think that's going to happen. I think Seattle's kind of they have the upper hand in this point. In those types of negotiations with a flat cap and a whole new team to fill, they'll be very easily above the cap floor. I don't think they'll have any trouble reaching it. So I think that it'll affect teams in just how if they're adding any players with term, but I don't think rentals will be too affected by it.
All right, we've got a little time left, so I'm going to ask you guys the one question I haven't had the chance to ask any of the other divisions when we talked about this. And Lewis, I'll start with you. What's the one splash? What's the one thing that you're looking for, whether it's in this division or outside of this division before Monday? What's the thing that you're watching for in this trade deadline?
I would definitely probably say Colorado's backup goaltending situation. I think, as we've seen, they've dominated teams. They've had 25 shots in periods a whole bunch of times. They've had 4 or 5 goal periods a bunch of times. They're just a dominant team this year at times. And if they can get a backup goaltender in there that can take some of the pressure off of Philip Grubauer, it would just make them probably maybe the favorite out of, I guess, not the Western Conference anymore, but the favorite to make it to the Stanley Cup final.
Yeah, if they can add that goalie, man, they're dangerous. Josh, what about you? Is there a storyline that you're watching closely for Monday?
Taylor Hall. I mean, it's such a weird situation. I mean, Buffalo is obviously hardcore selling. There was talks at one point about him wanting to stay there, but those just seem to have gone out the window. What team? I just don't know what teams are going to give. I'm so curious what teams are going to give up. We saw what Palmieri and Zajac cost, but Hall is such a weird figure where he was a former first overall pick. He's won the MVP, but also this season and last season with Arizona were not up to his standards.
What'll be very interesting for me with Taylor Hall is if we see a trade and then we hear about a signing right after it. That I think could be very possible and very interesting because that would hugely affect the return, right? If you're trading for a guy like Hall and you've got a deal in your back pocket, could be very, very interesting. All right, guys, thank you very much. I appreciate you guys coming in here to talk about your division. Lewis, Josh, I appreciate it. And if we get the chance to talk about some other stuff after this trade deadline's over, I hope you get the chance to join us.
Absolutely. Enjoyed it.
All right, guys, we got one more division coming up here, and we're going to get to that one right away. All right, everybody, we've got one more division to cover. We're going to be covering the North Division now. We've got 3 guests on with us this time. One's going to be covering 2 teams and helping me out a little bit. We've got Kevin Armstrong here with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Hey, Kevin, how you doing?
Hey, great. How you doing, Jim?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for coming on. Matthew Zador, who covers the Vancouver Canucks. Matthew, how you doing?
Doing good, Jim. How you doing?
Good. And Colton, who does a lot of the shows with me for the Oilers Overtime podcast, Colton Pankey is with us. Colton, how you doing, buddy?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Good. Okay, so let's start, Colton, with you because we're going to have you cover 2 teams here at once. Let's go to Calgary a little bit. We now know, or at least we think we know, they're probably sellers, right? It's really unrealistic for them to think that they've got a decent shot at this thing. So what's the big storyline coming out of Calgary, that they're selling? Do you think a lot of that's going to happen this season, or are they more of a team that's going to do stuff in the offseason?
Yeah, I mean, they have a couple guys here that might get moved. Derek Ryan's one that's getting talked about a fair bit. But I think the big changes, you hear the Gaudreaus, the Monahan, stuff like that. That's stuff that with any team, I think those big ones are generally in the offseason. So I think there'll be some big things that come in Calgary, but not at the deadline.
Who's the most likely player moved? Is it David Riddick? Is it Derek Ryan? Sam Bennett's been talked about a lot, but he's been playing pretty good. And Daryl Sutter seems to think like maybe he's sticking around. So who's the guy that you think gets moved here?
I think since Bennett's still an RFA at the end of the year, I don't think they're as desperate to move him right now. Riddick makes a lot of sense just because teams were so after goalies, especially with the waiver wire and everything this year. But I still think Derek Ryan's the guy. If anyone does get traded, he'd be my number 1 pick.
And do you think that we're in for a massive shakeup here in Calgary? Like, they've now hired a coach they said is not going anywhere. So we now know that Daryl Sutter is going to be running that bench regardless of what happens here. So does Tree Living really shake this up? Like, is it a lot of talk, or is it kind of like, no, there's going to be fire? Like, he's going to do some stuff here.
I think he has to. He's definitely on the hot seat. He's been there for 7 years, and they haven't had really any playoff success. And then there's this year. So I think he's tried to hold on to that core for quite a while now, and clearly it's not working. So I think there'll be I thought last offseason there'd be a big one. I'd be shocked if nothing happens this offseason. I think Gaudreau likely, if not Gaudreau, then Monahan, but I'd say likely Gaudreau is in a different jersey next year.
Is there something you'd like to see them do as a fan, as a person who covers the team? Is there one play that you'd like to see Calgary make that you think is realistic for them?
I mean, there is I had heard a couple different guys talking the last few days, and then I wrote a post on it. I don't know how likely it is, but just giving the Buffalo a call regarding Jack Eichel. They'll have some cap space next season. They have some good pieces, some good young guys, and then obviously a good starting point like Gaudreau. So I think it'd be interesting to at least try. Obviously, that will be a huge haul, but I think that'd be an interesting one to keep an eye on.
Awesome. Okay, Kevin, let's move on over to you. Let's talk about Toronto. Everybody likes to talk about Toronto. When we're talking about hockey, center of the universe. We're talking about the North Division. They've been at the top of the standings, if not all season, most of the season. What do you think Dubas does here? Is he in a position where he can actually buy, as much as everybody likes to talk about how Toronto's going to buy? Like, can he do it? Does he have the cap space? He pulls off a lot of stuff. Is he possible for him?
Yeah, I think it is. And the way that they're kind of setting up, he did do a little clip on the TSN broadcast a few days ago where his quote was, "It's all on the table for us." We obviously know it's not all on the table for the Maple Leafs, but he has said, and he even showed his hand a month or more ago, that top prospects he would put out there. And while everybody likes to say the Leafs are going to push all the chips into the middle of the table and go all in, Dubas has been saying that that's never been the plan, and that's not what we're going to do. We're going to be successful over the next few years, not just one season. But then he also says it's all on the table for us. So it's kind of tough. And I guess when you're a GM in this situation with all eyes on him, as you said, with the center of the universe, you can't look desperate at this point, or people are going to be taking you to the woodshed for everything that you've got in the cupboard. So he's got to play it pretty smart, or the asking price would be very high whenever Dubas calls.
So I have 2-part question for you here, because we know that Dubas has said that he's open to moving a top prospect. So part 1 is, who is that top prospect, or who, maybe even better, is not in that group of top prospects that he's willing to move? And 2, we know that can't be the only deal, because a top prospect doesn't come with the salary cap that he's going to need to make a money out, money in trade. So what else would have to go with that top prospect if that was a trade that was done before Monday?
It's such an interesting game when it comes to the money side of things. They've got about $500,000 in cap space right now, and that's just by pushing paperwork around that they even have that. But obviously, there's got to be somebody to go to bring in any kind of impact player that would come with this. And everybody's been looking at that player as being Alex Kerfoot. He has a $3.5 million hit and one more year on his contract. He's not been a liability on the ice, but when you look at that payroll, he's the 9th highest player, gets bottom 6 minutes. He could go if they found that player that they're really looking for. The other one that's very interesting to me, and I just don't know how it's going to work, and no one outside of the Maple Leafs facility knows, but Frederick Anderson and his $5 million hit, the guy has not been on the ice since March 19th. I don't know if it's going to be a trade just to get him off the books, and you open up $5 million to bring somebody in, and then he becomes a free agent at the end of this year, or if they move him to LTIR and use that money that way. Or does Frederick Anderson come back? Sheldon Keefe just said that he's not concerned with Frederick Anderson's progress. And does Freddie come back and suddenly you don't need a goalie there? So that's kind of the money situation at this point. As far as the picks goes, they've got some excellent prospects in the system. The Rasmus Sandins, the Nick Robertsons of the world, Rodin Amarov, their top pick from last draft. Now, when these names were thrown out, Keefe said it would take a significant deal to move those types of players. On the bottom end of that, there's Timothy Liljegren, who's only had 11 games in the NHL and has been with the Marlies for 4 years now. He could be a guy that gets moved because he does have a lot of upside potential. And then there's a couple of lower draft picks along the way that they could sweeten the pot with that are still good high prospects, but not those gems that are part of Toronto's future that he could ship out.
Now you brought up the goaltending, and I wanted to ask you about that because we've heard, we don't know what injury status is for Frederick Anderson. We've seen how great Jack Campbell has been. He's got 10 straight wins now, and that was a really emotional time for him. But there's always that little lurking injury concern in the background for Campbell. So do you think Toronto sticks with this? Like, they've said all the right things. They've said, we're not concerned about this. Nobody seems to believe them, though. So is this one of those situations where they're going to add one more and maybe see if they can get a third string just as insurance, or they're going to run with what they've got?
And that's, again, kind of back to what I said at the beginning, that if Keefe had have said during that interview, yeah, Anderson's on the shelf, then every time Dubas called a GM and the GM picked up the phone and saw Kyle Dubas's name on there, the price tag for his goaltenders is going to double, right? So they've got to say that we still have our number one when the season started available. I don't know, but to me, the fact that Freddie wasn't very solid for a lot of those games, even when he did play the 22 games, he needed a lot of offense in front of him. To me, I still think that they need somebody else. Every time Jack Campbell goes down and makes sprawling acrobatic saves, you kind of hold your breath and you wait to see if he's getting up fast too, because it's that knee that just kind of jerks out of place on him every once in a while, and then he's off for 2 weeks. And in a playoff situation, you're done. You're out of the round then without him. And, Michael Hutchinson, if you look at that roster, he was the guy that went the longest in the playoffs last year. So no offense to Michael Hutchinson when he was with Colorado, but he's not the guy that Toronto would be wanting in net for that playoff push that they're hoping for. So to answer your question, I absolutely think they've got to go out and get somebody to at least be the backup to Campbell and be a very solid backup.
Matthew, let's move on to Vancouver here. I'll start with the news that we heard today. Now, I'm not sure as we record this if this was officially announced by Vancouver, but Tanner Pearson, 3-year deal, 3.25, I think it is, per season. What's your take on that deal?
Yeah, it was officially announced by the Canucks. So, yeah, it's a done deal. 3.25, I'm mixed on the opinion on it. I mean, he is a veteran. He's 29 years old. 3 years on it. He's going into his 30s, and the Canucks I don't know what they're doing. I mean, they've got Quinn Hughes, Elias Pettersson contracts coming up. I mean, they're probably going to be, at this point, I'm looking at it's probably going to be a bridge deal for both those guys. I don't think they're going to, be able to do those big contracts at this point, but signing a guy like Tanner Pearson for 3 years at a little bit over $3 million. To me, I mean, he's a great veteran player. He could still play that second line role, but on a really good team, I think he's a third, fourth line guy. And with the Canucks, all the young guys coming up, I think it's a little bit of a long 3 years, a little long for me. But as much as I love how he plays with Bo Horvat and the character he brings to the dressing room, I think it's a little bit of a long, 3 years, a little long for me. Yeah.
Well, when we talk about the deadline, we asked the Pearson question, and we talk about Thatcher Demko getting the contract as well this year. We have to know that what Vancouver plans on doing with some of their free agents, including Elias Pettersson, things like that, is going to play a huge factor as to what they can do here at the deadline. But are they declaratively sellers, and do they have assets that people are going to be interested in prior to Monday?
I think the Canucks do have assets that they could put on the market that teams are going to be interested in. With this COVID-19 stuff that's going on, most of the team on the COVID list right now, I don't know, depending on how these guys are going to be able to be recovered, if some of them have it. There are reports that some of them may not have it. They're just, the direct contact stuff. But, guys like Jordy Ben, Travis Hamonic, guys like that could be depth guys that teams would be fine getting. Even you go into the point of, Jake Virtanen and Adam Gaudette, those guys have been, talked about during the season as well as being guys that could be on the market, and the Canucks could get some, young assets for. I don't know if that's going to happen. Tanner Pearson's off the table now because he just re-signed. I don't think, that's kind of bad business to trade a guy after you sign him. That's not going to happen. And he was talked about as being a guy. Alex Edler, he probably won't waive his no movement clause, which, has been a kind of a sticking point in the past. There's been talk that he could waive it for a Stanley Cup contender. I don't know if that would happen. That would have to be Canucks declaratively saying, we're selling, this season's a bust. Trading a guy like Edler is basically signaling that that's what it is. So if that happens, that's definitely the message moving forward. But yeah, the Canucks definitely do have assets that teams may want. And, even a guy like Brandon Sutter, but there's been, rumors of it's rumors. I mean, that he's having a hard time with COVID. And, but I mean, healthy, he's a great third, fourth line guy. And he is unrestricted free agent this season as well, this offseason. So he'd be more of a rental for a team, but if playoff teams would definitely look at him as well as a third, fourth line for the playoffs.
Does any of this, I mean, I'll just to answer, a human aspect question, does any of this really matter when we're talking about Vancouver, considering what they're going through right now? And we've heard their games are delayed. We talk about the 2 games of the Oilers this next week that aren't even being replaced. We don't know if they're going to have games to make up. Are we looking at a season? Is your hunch here that this is probably going to be most of what they're not going to finish? There's no way they get in 56 games. And
the longer it goes on and the longer that, games keep getting postponed, it's looking that way. And, to crunch in with that, that extended period that the NHL's basically put in as, this is the hard date we're ending. And there's been talk about the North Division kind of playing on when the other divisions are starting the playoffs already too. So, I mean, it's getting to a point where it gets to after the deadline, the Canucks haven't played yet. And it's looking like it could be just a wash. And, the trade deadline may not even be a factor.
Colton, I'm going to move over to you to cover our last team here in detail. And you and I can toss back and forth here because we both cover the Oilers regularly here. We've talked about this on Oilers Overtime, and we think I think we're both in agreement. This is probably going to be a pretty quiet deadline. But for me, I'm starting to get the sense that maybe there's something lurking in the background here. Like, I don't know if there's no move possible because the Oilers just don't have the cap space. But do you get the sense that maybe there's a trade here that Holland could do to move some money out and bring some money in? Or are we just wishful thinking here as Oilers fans?
I mean, the one that keeps popping up the last couple of days that I'm sure you've seen is the Taylor Hall, which we talked about.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I still don't see how it can happen. I don't think it makes much sense. And like, there's even talks about a sign and trade now with not just with Edmonton, but with a few teams. I still think it'll be quiet. Obviously, the one guy I really wanted to bring in was Eric Stahl for that third line center. Seems like the Glendening stuff's really died down. Derek Ryan, you're hearing a bit, but I really still don't think there's going to be anything, but who knows?
Yeah, well, the Hall stuff is interesting because they keep talking about this whole idea of him coming back to Edmonton, which would be like a whole fairy tale thing. Now, discounting how unproductive he's been this season, the talk is that they get him and Nugent Hopkins signed for both combined 12 million or less, which I just don't know how that's even possible and what money you move out. But that was Doug McLean, I guess, is the one who reported that, and he said a reliable source told him that they were working on it. Now it's just speculation, obviously, and I don't think it's going to happen, but it's always interesting that just sort of lurks in the background there, right? What about, in terms of the Oilers in general? Here's a team that's pretty front loaded. They've had some decent production from their back end in Tyson Barrie, Darnell Nurse. Is there anything that you think the Oilers really kind of need to add here? Maybe they can't, but is there a target that they should be looking for here?
I think the back end's fine. I still think if they could get that, I was big on the third line center. I think now if they could just get even a fourth line guy on the for a centerman, just with their whole penalty kill and everything being down this year, obviously with Riley Sheahan, his departure last year, I think that played a big role in that taking a hit. So I think if a guy like that, or even him himself, obviously he's in Buffalo, so maybe that's a guy they could pick up for cheap. I think if they could add something like that, but I just can't see them making a big move this year. Obviously, there's areas they need to improve. I think goaltending being one, top six forward, but I can't see any of those taking place at the deadline for them.
Yeah, I'm of the opinion that I think the Oilers think they're in pretty good shape. They're relatively healthy. They made a lot of moves this past offseason, and they've got some depth there. They've got a lot of players that people are wanting them to play, the Evan Bouchards of the world and things like that. They just aren't even inserting into the lineup because they're too concerned about wins and losses and whether or not experimenting with a young guy like Bouchard is even a good idea. So when you're in that kind of a situation, you have that much depth and that many healthy players, there's really not a huge need. Holland said at some point, the only way that I'm doing anything is if I'm clearly upgrading what I currently have. So when you've got guys in depth roles and you like what they're doing for you, you need to know whatever you're adding is going to be a clear upgrade over that position. And the Oilers don't have the money. They just don't have the way to spend it to get that upgrade unless they ship out a Cassian or a McCoskinen or a Neal. And I just don't see that as realistic. I just don't know how any team's going to want to take on a James Neal. Even teams that are willing like Chicago or San Jose to add salary, I just don't see it. So we're probably not going to have a lot to say when it comes to the Oilers. So we'll move on. But Kevin, I'm going to move over to you with Montreal because here's a team now that we thought about a week ago was done, wasn't going to do anything, had no way of doing it. Now we obviously know we can't listen to Marc Bergevin and what he says because when he's saying it, he's probably the best poker playing GM in the league. But now Gallagher's down, right? Which silver lining here, you don't want Gallagher out for the regular season, but Montreal's probably in the playoffs at this point. He's going to come back for the playoffs, it looks like. So is this the greatest situation that Montreal could have fallen into? Because now they all of a sudden have the ability to go shopping.
Exactly. They opened up some cap space miraculously. Yeah, absolutely. I don't agree. I don't believe anything Bergevin says. So it was no surprise to me when Stahl went there, and what a deal for Montreal to grab him for nearly nothing, it seems to me. And they've got a very solid player that would have looked great in Edmonton, but yeah, Montreal, I still think is up to something out there. What that could be at this point, I don't know. Covering Toronto, I feel like I'm just so anti-Montreal that it kind of makes my skin boil to talk Montreal right now. But I really, they're up to something. They're always up to something. It's those Montreal Canadiens. They're always up to something out there. So yeah, they could definitely still be making moves.
Well, Bergevin has, for lying through his teeth, he certainly has tipped his hand about the fact that he's all in this season. Like he spent more money, I think more money than almost any team in any sport in an offseason where the COVID had impacted everybody financially. He still spent a crazy amount of money. So he's all in on the season. Matthew, do you think there's somebody that they are targeting? Is it blue line? Is it a forward help? What do you think if Montreal is going to go swinging? And I do think that they will probably try. What do you think they're adding?
Well, after adding Stahl, they're pretty deep, and I think maybe a defenseman could be a depth defenseman to be added. to strengthen the blue line even more. I think that's probably something they do because their forward depth is quite good with the way Corey Perry's kind of fit in there as well. And he was a monster in the playoffs for Dallas last season as well. So, I wouldn't be surprised if he turns it up in the playoffs again. And Eric Stahl, we know what he can do too. So I think, if they do something on the forward group, I think they may go for a winger to strengthen the wings. But Montreal's that. Yeah, I think they will probably. They're not done making moves. I'll say that.
Colton, what about you? Are we looking at a situation where Montreal might be among the most active teams heading into the deadline? And a week ago, we thought they were done.
I mean, maybe, like you said, I think they did so much this offseason already, and I think Bergevin did. He was all in. And really, I think it could be, I don't know if he'll lose his job, but I think he is on the hot seat depending on how they perform this year. They've had some up and down years in his tenure there. So I do think if he makes another couple moves here, like Matthew said, I think bringing in a defenseman maybe would make sense. Out of all the Canadian teams, I think them and Toronto are probably the two most likely to add something.
Let's finish off with our final team here. Kevin, I'll start with you first. The Ottawa Senators. We know they're sellers. We knew they'd be sellers at the beginning of all this. They added a bunch of pieces that they could sell when the season started, and that was kind of their plan. How much of this do you think takes part before Monday? How much does Ottawa play a role here? Do they take on salary? Do they move out players? Can they move out a bunch of players? I mean, they're playing pretty decent hockey of late. What do you think happens in Ottawa?
Yeah, they're actually not a bad team if they didn't have to play Edmonton.
Yeah,
He's unreal. But Ryan Dzingel gets talked about in Ottawa to be a piece to move, and he would be a nice addition for a playoff run for a few teams. Every goalie that Ottawa seems to put in net for their first start seems to do pretty well to start. So they've got some depth pieces. We know that they're rebuilding around a fairly young core there. So pretty much anyone that's an old guy, which in Ottawa would be 27 plus, is going to be shopped at this point. And there's some quality there. And I look back, DJ Smith was behind the bench in Toronto for a few years. And if you're a Leafs fan, maybe you're wondering if there's still some blue in his veins that he'd say, we'll send him to Toronto, give him a discount. I guess not. He's in Ottawa, the rivalry now, but that's an exciting team to watch. If they didn't play Edmonton this year, then they would have been pretty good, but they'll be shipping out some assets for sure.
Matthew, is there a storyline coming out of Ottawa that you're particularly watching?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking they will be getting rid of some of their, veteran assets, older guys, because, they are, like you said, they're rebuilding. They definitely are rebuilding. They got a ton of young talent that's not just there now, but coming up. And they're going to be a hell of a team moving forward. And to add to that haul again, I mean, I wouldn't hesitate to do it. And, guys, the veterans, like I'm looking at, a guy like Chris Tierney for a playoff team. That's actually, he's a pretty good asset to trade out, and he's not overly old either. So, I mean, they could probably get something pretty good for him. And like Dzingel just got back to Ottawa, and he's talking about going again. So it's going to be interesting to watch that team, not just at this deadline, but in the coming years.
I'm not sure how much interest there actually is in Dzingel. He seems to only play good in Ottawa. That just seems to be the way that it goes for him. He plays well in Ottawa, and he doesn't do so great everywhere else. All right, Colton, we're going to close this thing off. I'm going to start with you. Don't have to stick within the North Division, but what is the one storyline headed into Monday that what? Just got a little note here. I totally overglanced Winnipeg. Yeah. Nobody told me. I just shot right past Winnipeg. So Colton, let's go to you.
The first time Winnipeg's been forgotten about.
Oh my gosh. I'm gonna get ridden on that one for sure in the comment section. All right, Colton, let's do Winnipeg before we move on to that last question. What happens there? We know they're looking for a defenseman. We know they're probably willing to pay pretty well for that defenseman. Do you see a particular blue liner on their radar?
Well, it's funny because I think everyone in that up here just kind of forgets about them in the division to begin with. Like they're kind of the team that is really under the radar because I think they're really good up front anyway. Like you said, defensemen that they could be going after. It's so tough with COVID. It's so tough to get guys that are out of the North Division. So one in particular, I mean, there's a few guys whose names are getting floated around. Obviously, I think Sami Vatanen's a guy in New Jersey that isn't playing a ton there right now, and he's been pretty productive over the years. He's cheap. Maybe that's one that they look into. But yeah, I think they definitely need to improve their blue line if they can. But still a really good team, and not one that I think you'd want to get matched up against in the playoffs.
Kevin, I think it was you that sent me the note to remind me about Winnipeg, so I appreciate that. How big a threat do you think the Jets are this season? Like they're a pretty loaded team. If they can find the right piece there, how good will they be?
No, and you'll get the hate on that, but no disrespect. Like you do forget about them, and maybe it's because we lost them for those years. You kind of wipe it off and try to forget about it and move on, that we haven't fully accepted they've been back. But man, when you watch those Jets, those top 6 forwards that is a loaded, talented team in that top 6. So I'm with you, Colton. I see them loading up something on the defensive front. I think their offensive lines are clicking. Dubois is going to be an absolute warrior in the playoffs. And look at Scheifele when he would have been amazing in last year's playoffs if he hadn't been hurt by somebody that plays in Calgary. And he's going to be a warrior too. So I see them getting a defenseman. They've got the Vezina guy in the net. Like, give me a break. This is a team that could really make it happen. And they had a defensive piece there, then they could really, really be a threat.
Yeah, you bring up Dubois. I think that's a very interesting point, and I'm wondering how much Winnipeg is happy that they made that trade at this point. Matthew, is there a storyline that you're watching out of Winnipeg? I'll give you like 30 seconds. What are you thinking there?
Just playing against the Jets over the years, the Canucks just have no answer for them. So I definitely know the frustration that they can pose and the threat they can pose to teams with Hellebuck and Ned and the firepower they got up front. And if they add something, I'd say on defense, definitely if they add a significant piece on the blue line, they're going to be tough to beat. And like Kevin talked about Scheifele, he can turn it up and be a monster in the playoffs. And Dubois, we know how he can play with his size and his speed. The Jets are kind of looked over, but they can come out of nowhere and beat, I'd say, anyone in this division.
All right. So before I forgot about the team, I was going to go to Colton and ask, is there a storyline that you're watching? Something, even if it's not in this division, that you're kind of paying close attention to before Monday?
Yeah, I mean, one that I've been curious about with just how bad St. Louis has been in the last couple of weeks here is what they're going to do at the deadline. They have some players that they've been rumored to be moving, like Mike Hoffman could be an interesting name. So I'm interested to see if they stand pat, if they're still buyers, sellers. They're in a tricky spot. There's them, a few teams. Nashville's another one, but I'm really interested to see what St. Louis does with some of their guys that are on expiring deals, Hoffman in particular.
Kevin, who's the name that you're watching?
It was tough. I started putting together a cheat sheet for our readers for the Leafs, and it was about 3,000 words later, and that was trying to keep it as a summary. It's really difficult. It could be just because everything's up in the air right now. But to me, obviously, the one that everyone will be watching is Taylor Hall. I think more on the name, and he had one good season with the Heart there, but he signed as a free agent when no one else wanted him for a one-year deal. So I think that gets blown out of proportion by fans more than anything. But I think it's Columbus Blue Jackets and what they're going to do with David Savard and Nick Foligno. And when I put that article out on the cheat sheet, a lot of comments came in with bringing Foligno back or to Toronto. Obviously, his dad played there. And if they could add David Savard on the blue line with that, I don't know what you'd have to pay Columbus to get those two players, but that would be a really nice fit for Toronto.
Matthew, I won't leave you out. What do you got? You got a storyline you're watching?
I mean, just generally of how busy this deadline is going to be. I mean, we had that big deal yesterday with the Islanders. That may get the ball rolling at the Florida deal today. I think it's just going to be interesting to see what type of activity there is and what activity will happen, kind of outside of divisions. I think right now, a lot of it's just kind of going on around, especially in Canada, I think the North is just going to be dealing in the North. But I say in general, I think just looking at how COVID and all this stuff's going to be, how the deadline is going to play out, how much activity will be on the day, may not be as busy as we're normally used to with the craziness, and it's going to be interesting to see what type of deals actually happen.
Yeah, I'm curious to see if there's a big swinger, who that big swinger is, and if it's Florida or if it's somebody, because it's got to be like we've seen a couple deals already, which we didn't know that we would, but it's teams that had cap space that made those trades. So it'll be interesting to see if that continues, and that's the only deals we see, if it's cap space teams that do it, or if somebody gets creative and figures out another way to do some stuff, because there are some teams that want to be active, but they don't have the money and the space to do it. So they're going to have to get really creative, Toronto included, to see how they all pull that off. All right, guys, thank you very much. I appreciate you joining us for the closer look at the North Division. Kevin, Matthew, Colton, thank you for coming on. And when we get the chance to talk about all this stuff again after the trade deadline, I hope I can get you guys back on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
That was the NHL Trade Deadline primer from THW. We appreciate you staying tuned for all the divisions. Don't forget, like and subscribe to this YouTube page. Hit that like and the thumbs up button on Facebook. Share this with everybody. We appreciate you joining us for the NHL Trade Deadline primer, and we'll probably have a follow-up video after it's all done to talk about what happened.